Perhaps the most valuable real estate in the world is that narrow band of wetlands that literally ring the Earth's oceans. They serve as buffers from storms, filters, and as nurseries for finfish and shellfish. Most birds and creatures that live far from shore are also connected to the marsh. Here in North Carolina, you can see spartina marshes when you cross bridges, going to some of your favorite beaches. These marshlands are among my favorite places for exploration because they are literally the edge of life. When you think of valuable crops, you probably think of corn, soybeans, or tobacco. Marshlands don't come in neat rows. They look barren or sterile, and the thick mud to some people can have an unpleasant odor. Few places, however, harbor more life or are as valuable to man. For commercial and sport fishermen, and to the tourist industry, the marsh is crucial. Everything here is tied together. Grasses grow in the mud that feed and hide the crabs that feed the birds. To understand more about salt marshes and the diversity of life found there, I talked with Trish Murphy, who understands the rhythm of the marsh.
I'm a biologist with the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries here in Morehead City, and I work with several other biologists in the management of finfish and shellfish, several species of shellfish such as shrimp, blue crab, oysters, clams and scallops, as well as recreationally and commercially important fish. All the species that we manage are tied together through habitat, and these habitats include the salt marsh and the eelgrass beds. They depend on these habitats for refuge, for food, for shelter, and also their prey species depend on these areas for food and shelter. There's several species of mollusks that you'll find in this area around salt marshes and eelgrass, but the three species that we work with mostly are hard clams, oysters, and bay scallops. I'm sure everybody's been to restaurants and had oyster on the half shell or clam strips, but you can also come out and dig for clams or look for oysters along edges of marsh, and also look for bay scallops in your seagrass beds.
If you want to see the marsh up close and see its wonders for yourself, the best ways are the quiet ones. You can wade, paddle a canoe or kayak, or pull a skiff with no engine noise. By being quiet, you may get lucky and see a turtle gliding over an eelgrass bed, or see a stingray flying. You'll appreciate the clarity of the water, filtered by the marsh and its creatures.
Another important thing about shellfish is that they're filter feeders. Oysters especially are very important to the ecology of the estuary because they can filter and clean the water. Just like our shellfish, there's also several different species of crustaceans in North Carolina. However, we're most involved with shrimp and blue crabs. We have three species of shrimp. There's a brown shrimp and a pink shrimp and white shrimp, and we also have the blue crab. The blue crab fishery is our most valuable fishery in the state and has been the most valuable for several years now. There's lots of species of fish that hang around in these habitats, the salt marsh and the eelgrass habitats. Some of the ones that are recreationally and commercially important that you may be familiar with are your flounder, your red drum. Your red drum like to cruise around seagrass beds. Mullet, striped mullet, you can find them around the edges of salt marsh, as well as your trouts, such as your weak fish.
You can catch your own fish with hook and line, but the next best place to get the freshest seafood is at a coastal seafood house, where the catch of the day is always fresh. Everything at a seafood house or restaurant is directly or indirectly tied to the marsh and its cycles.
Another thing that's important in regards to the salt marsh is the tides. In North Carolina, we have two different types of tides. We have a lunar tide and we have wind-driven tides. The lunar tides being influenced by the moon, and during the full moon, new moon, we get much higher tides than in between. What's important about this is once the marsh is flooded and begins to recede, it takes out with it food sources such as plankton and detritus that are the species of fish that we manage feed on. There's several different methods of sampling that we use to manage our fisheries. These include the seine, which we use for red drum. We have electroshocking boats that go out and check striped mullet. We have clam rakes, and we also use the otter trawl. The otter trawl is probably one of our more valuable tools because we can go up into the nursery areas and look at the juveniles of brown shrimp and flounders and spot and croaker. The salt marsh is valuable all year long. Even though you may see it brown and dead in the winter, it's just as valuable as in the summer when it is green and tall. The reason it's this valuable year long is because of when it dies off and it creates detritus and organic material that different species of fish and shellfish and clams feed on.
One thing that Trish doesn't manage, that depends on the marsh, is the tremendous number and variety of birds that call the marsh home. Walker Golder of Audubon, North Carolina, knows the birds that use the marsh as their living room, dining room, and nursery.
We're sitting here on the edge of the Sound in a beautiful spartina marsh. And many folks in the state don't realize how important this marsh ecosystem is. It is the base of the food chain, and all living things on the North Carolina coast depend on the marsh at some point in their life cycle. Whether we're talking about fish or shrimp or even birds, they all are inextricably tied to this marsh system. It's the base of the food chain, and it's the engine that drives our North Carolina coast. Water birds of this state have two basic needs in order to maintain their populations and survive. They need a safe place to nest and raise their young. The habitats that they depend on for nesting vary dependent on species. Some species will nest on the beach, other species will nest on islands, some species will nest in the marsh, some species will nest in the thicket. Depends on whether you're talking about pelicans or gulls or terns or wading birds. The other thing these nesting sites have to have is that they have to be free of predators and free of human disturbances. That's what makes a good nesting area. The second thing our coastal birds need is they need an adequate and abundant food supply. Some species of birds feed on schooling fish like menhaden and mullet and silversides. Other species might feed on shrimp or crabs. Still other species might actually feed on oysters or clams, but they have one thing in common. All of these food items are directly linked to the health of our coastal marshes, the productivity of our grass flats, and water quality. Many of the species of water birds that we have on the North Carolina coast depend on fish as the bulk of their diet. Pelicans, for example, feed primarily on menhaden that they catch in the sounds and the river systems. Studies that we've done in southern Pamlico Sound and in the lower Cape Fear River have shown that a pelican's diet during the breeding season is made up of more than 95% menhaden. They'll feed on a few other things, but menhaden are the key. Other species like royal terns and sandwich terns and common terns and black skimmers feed on a wide variety of fish. They feed on menhaden, but they also feed on killifish, they feed on silversides, they feed on mullet. They'll occasionally take shrimp too. The one thing that they share in common is that all of those food items grow up in the marsh, they have their beginnings in the marsh, they're directly linked to the health of our coastal marshes.
The terns and pelicans are coastal favorites, but for many, it is the regal wading birds that remind us most of the marsh. Watching them move with stealth and grace is one of nature's best shows.
Wading birds are another group of birds that depend on our coastal marshes. And by wading birds, I'm talking about the herons, the egrets, and the ibises. Generally, those birds with long necks and long legs that are familiar to a lot of folks on the North Carolina coast. These birds feed in shallow bays and in the marshes and on the grass flats, and they feed on fish and shrimp and crabs that they find in these areas. Some of our coastal birds are specialists. The oyster catcher, for example. There's probably not a brighter, showier bird that we have on the coast with that bright orange bill, black hood, white belly. Some people find it hard to believe that oyster catchers actually do catch oysters. They catch oysters in a couple of different ways. They'll tiptoe along an oyster bed and hammer the shell of young oysters, breaking the shell and shuck the oyster out. They'll also tiptoe along an oyster bed and wait to catch oysters when they're sitting there just with a little bit of their shell open. And they'll take that bill and jab it down in between those shells, cut the muscle that holds the two shells of an oyster together and shuck the oyster out just as clean as anything. They'll eat a variety of other things like razor clams and other species of clams. But the one thing that they share in common is the oysters, the clams, are filter feeders, and they're directly dependent on our coastal marshes.
I asked Walker if there are birds that use our marshes that come from other states and countries.
We're in a beautiful green marsh in the summertime, but marshes are important for birds year-round. During fall migration and again during spring, thousands of shorebirds stop off in North Carolina marshes to fuel up for their next leg of migration. They stop off in areas like mudflats that you see behind me. They gather tiny little invertebrates that live in the mud, and this fuel that they get here might carry them to the Caribbean or even to South America, and it fuels their migrations back again in the spring. During the winter, waterfowl, ducks, geese, and swans depend on marshes, and they depend on our grass flats on the coast to provide them food, to get them through the winter months and fuel their migrations back to their northern breeding grounds.
Neither Walker nor I play favorites, but there is one final bird that is most like an action hero, intense and powerful. It is the ultimate avian predator of the marsh and sounds, the osprey, also known as the fishhawk. From a distance, the salt marsh looks uninviting, and that's why many were drained and even paved over for parking lots. Jeff Cordes, a biologist for Cape Lookout National Seashore, helped me to understand the productivity and value of these unique lands.
When you walk into a forest, it's obvious that that's a very productive area. You have lots of different plants and animals that can live there. When you walk to a salt marsh, that's definitely not obvious because it's a harsh environment to live in. But the things that can live there do very well. They're constantly getting new nutrients every time the tide comes in. Wastes are being carried away. The soil is very productive. And because of those things, the marsh is one of the most productive ecosystems in the world, able to produce up to 10 tons of organic material a year, which is more than even a wheat field can do. The amount of water in the marsh determines what kinds of plants and animals can live there. In areas like where we're sitting now, grass is going to be covered twice a day by salt water. Some of the higher spots are only going to get salt water on them at the most extreme tides. That will limit what kind of plants and animals can grow in those areas. Different animals are adapted to different parts of the salt marsh. At the highest areas of the marsh, the spots that aren't normally underwater, you'll find things like coffee bean snails and squareback crabs that don't like to be underwater and can't swim, but like being in a wet environment. Once you get in the areas covered by the tide twice a day, you'll run into ribbed mussels and fiddler crabs. The fiddler crabs will come out to feed when the tide's low, but jump into burrows for protection when the tide covers the area. Closest to the water, you'll run into animals like blue crabs and shrimp. One thing that makes the marsh very different than most other types of environments is there aren't things that are able to handle feeding on the grass while it's alive. Other than a few insects, most of that marsh grass will die back in the wintertime, decompose into detritus, which is a basic food source for things around the salt marsh. Detritus is so plentiful that a good acre of salt marsh might have 1 million fiddler crabs on it.
Jeff took me to a colony of fiddler crabs, where we saw them visiting and dining. We even watched the head fiddler conduct the local symphony orchestra.
I asked Jeff to demonstrate one of his sampling techniques, much in the same way that Trish Murphy had demonstrated techniques used by the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries.
As a biologist with the National Park Service, I get to see the animals that depend on the marsh every day. But one of the best ways to see things up close is to pull a seine net through the water in an area next to the salt marsh.
In Jeff's nets and viewing bags, I saw local fish like killifish, croaker, pinfish, and mullet. His samples also showed juvenile Florida pompano and permit, normally found on tropical flats.
There are other marine animals that depend on the marsh even though they may not live there throughout their life. Sea turtles are a good example. They spend a large portion of their life offshore, far away from the marsh, but when they come back to this area as juveniles, depend directly on it for food, things like horseshoe crabs, snails, and barnacles. Bottlenose dolphin are another example. They depend directly on some of the fish species that are produced by the salt marsh.
No trip to salt marshes would be complete without a visit with the famous Outer Banks ponies, which are a symbol of the North Carolina coast. Dr. Sue Stuska of Cape Lookout National Seashore works with and studies these magnificent animals.
It's been said that the outside of a horse is good for the inside of a man or a woman, and I find that that holds true today, especially when you find horses out here on the Outer Banks of North Carolina where they're running wild and free and doing what they do naturally in a natural situation. It's just something that excites us, that offers just wonderful viewing opportunities, and it's just really nice to go along, see them as we boat by, and then to know, even when we're not here, that they're out here free and protected. Horses are found in their wild state actually all the way up and down the eastern coast of the United States. We have horses here, of course, at Cape Lookout. Just north of here, there are horses at Cape Hatteras. Those are penned, but they were wild. And then all the way down to Cumberland Island in Georgia, there are wild horses. Perhaps the most frequently asked question about horses here on the Outer Banks is, where did they come from? Unfortunately, there's no easy answer to that question. We know that the horses in North America died out about the time of the Ice Age. Perhaps they crossed the Bering Land Bridge, and the early explorers brought horses back to these shores. Then the early colonists brought horses along, perhaps bred them, and then certainly residents of this particular area had horses and used them for hauling fish in, patrolling the beaches, and those kinds of things.
I have long seen the horses of the Outer Banks, but have never completely understood how they survive in such a tough, salty environment.
For most animals, and certainly domestic horses, this would be an alien environment. These horses here, however, have managed to adapt through the years and survive very well on the resources out here. The fresh water is available from underneath the island, and they will dig down to get it. And the spartina, one of the most prevalent marsh grasses, is one of the staples of their diet.
From an expert, I wanted to know how the Park Service handles the maintenance of these large, wild creatures.
The National Park Service and other groups that manage wild horses are very aware of our mission to manage the resource, the whole island and the horses also, in order to sustain them for years to come. We can use both birth control and adoption with the horses in order to make sure that their numbers stay in a range that will sustain the marshes and allow the creatures that live in the marsh their own life also. The horses are managed as wild animals, and as wild animals we keep track of them with numbers. They each have a number assigned. But those of us who work with them on a daily basis, and certainly those who see them frequently, begin to see the differences between the animals, and the horses also have names like Medusa, Hercules, Harriet, Phineas, and we begin to see the differences in the personalities of the animals as we get to know them better. All the creatures of the marsh rely on this ecosystem as their home and as their nursery, and the horses have become a part of this ecosystem, an inseparable part of it, and they coexist with all of the young creatures that grow up in the marsh and all of the species of grasses and plants that provide homes for all of the marsh creatures.
Now I hope you understand why the salt marsh is truly the edge of life and a feast for the eyes.